that a lot of young people feel safe talking to, which is very appropriate for our conversation today, safe people. So if you'll just join me in welcoming Dr. Ray Mitch.
Like a golfing match. Well, thank you for inviting me, Kimberly. It's such a joy to be back. Last time I did this, I closed the whole Lunch and Learn series, so I don't know, this may be a once and done thing. What I wanted to talk about is two different things. Basically, the idea of what safe people are. I think everybody in some respects thinks they're safe. The issue is we never have it completely defined as to what it means to be a safe person. And so I want to take a little time to reflect on what that looks like, and then also just a piece of, particularly with the youth that you interact with. And I've interacted with, my background, I've been in private practice for 40 years, and I kind of made teaching and that area, higher ed, kind of a second career of sorts. And so I cut my teeth on working with adolescents, and obviously they've changed a lot in 40 years. But I also get a glimpse of what they are in the sense of the students that come through CCU that I interact with. And that's been helpful, at least I think for me, to be able to get a glimpse of the kinds of issues that they're bringing in. And that's Christian youth, kids that are actually identified themselves as Christ followers. So in order to talk a little bit about what this looks like, one of the things that I just put in front of you is how we would describe a safe person. What is a safe person? We describe people in our lives as safe, but what exactly does it mean? What does it look like? And that's part of what I want to take some time to look at, because in a lot of cases, if I query my classes, most of them will say, well, they can keep a secret, they can keep a confidence. But that's about as far as it goes. It doesn't really go farther than that. And that's a pretty low bar in some respects. And a lot of our youth culture is very much contract based. So I will do this for you if you do this for me. And so there's this kind of uneasy collusion that goes into it. So one of the things I thought I would do is just to reflect on some of the responses that I've had students give me, and a few of them are up here. And generally how we tend to describe what an unsafe person is always in terms of us, in terms of how they impact us, maybe even who we are in their presence. Like the one down here, I tend to be a worse self with him or her. The other part of this is trust and safe people over time, not one situation at a time, but over time, provide us with a picture of what consistency looks like as far as being safe. In a lot of cases, safe people aren't safe for certain things, like doing destructive things in your life. They're not safe for that. So in a lot of cases, I think the youth that I've interacted with, certainly if you're pushing in on stuff, they know they need somebody that's courageous enough to do that, but that doesn't, in their mind, it doesn't necessarily make you safe. And so we've had an interesting shift, I think, about how our youth tend to see relationships. And there's a certain addiction to happiness and things being good, rather than the nuts and bolts, I think, of what life really is. So the other thing that I thought I would do is not only do a little poll here, but also do an exploration of how God defines safety or unsafety. And interestingly enough, when he starts talking about people that are unsafe, he talks about them in terms of their hearts, in terms of being far away or unfaithful or proud and perfectionistic, and those things are the things that he points to as qualities of somebody that is unsafe. So what we have to begin to unpack is some kind of relatively uniform understanding of what safe and unsafe actually is. So the other part of this is the issue of what I call judgmentalism, or judgmental versus character discernment. Increasingly, our youth are not really trained in character discernment. And part of that is because they are so drilled with "don't judge me" that they suspend all evaluation of everyone. And so they end up with pretty toxic people in their lives, and then wonder why it crashes and burns so often. So the whole idea of character discernment is an issue where if I've pitched this for many, many years, and I always get resistance because there's such an innate reaction to I'm being mean. I'm judging that person. Ultimately, the idea of judgment is about where they're going, not so much of who they are. And so whoops, what happened here? So part of that comes up around hello, wake up. Our system went down. There it is. So the thing that they will always resonate with is they choose friendships based on external qualities. And those external qualities define the nature of, how they relate, what we have in common, similarities, things like that. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, they define intimacy in terms of enmeshment, not necessarily in terms of being individuals and different, and having that be kind of the depth of their relationship with one another. Ultimately, when we get in a relationship with somebody, we find out what's really on the inside, how they relate, the assumptions they make, the nature of what they think about the world and how it works and everything else. So we really don't do a whole lot of training in discerning character, and that's kind of key, which also I think puts in front of youth workers, how do I begin this conversation? The characteristics of people, not as a statement of judgment and condemnation, but as a statement of let's be clear about the nature of the person you're in relationship with, and how this actually works, and how I am with that person is a clue, but they're not the only thing that goes into it. So the part of this that I point to is 3 different characteristics in terms of a safe person. And when we ask this, I think ultimately, even as leaders of any sort, we have to start with our own evaluation. I say this to such a degree that my students end up rolling their eyes and going into a comatose state, because I say you can't lead people someplace you've never been. If I haven't taken the time to self-reflect and self-evaluate, then how in the world am I going to try to help somebody else do that? And that doesn't mean I can't, but then I end up, it would be a little bit like going up in the mountains and approaching a guy to be the guide for you, man or woman, and say, have you ever been up there? And they say, no, but I've studied the maps real well. And it's like, okay, bye. End of conversation. So 3 different things I want to kind of highlight for us. One is drawing us closer to God. And when I say valuing freedom and grace, the challenge of freedom always is the 2-pronged nature of it. Okay, I'm more than happy as an adult, as a maybe a significant adult in a kid's life, I'm more than happy to give them freedom to make the right choice. But I'm not on board with the wrong choice, which is not really freedom. Which is not really freedom. Freedom is the ability to choose both things. The freedom to choose both things. And ironically, even throughout Scripture, you can look that God paints a picture of you do this, there will be these consequences, you do this, and he calls it blessings and etc. And I just finished reading Joshua, and he said the entire nation of Israel, choose who you will follow. At least be honest enough to say what you will do. and who you're going to follow. And that's very much a part of freedom. So the idea of grace is not only the grace to be saved, but the grace to live life with myself. And unfortunately, for a lot of these kids, you think in terms of the onset, I'm old enough to remember when social media didn't exist, thank goodness. But with the onset of that, it instituted something very naturally with adolescents anyway, and that's comparison, except it put it on steroids. So not only am I just comparing myself with my friends, my closest friends, I'm comparing myself to the whole world. Whoever I see on that screen is who I compare to, and guess who always wins? The person in the screen. So the whole idea of grace is one that I think theologically we embrace, but what does that actually mean in terms of nuts and bolts living with myself? And how gracious am I with myself? We're more than happy to be gracious with other people. Easy, piece of cake. But when it comes to ourselves, we know our motivations, we know all of that stuff, and we use that as a rap sheet for all the things that we should have or could have done or whatever goes into it. They also draw us closer to other people in terms of vulnerability, in terms of connection and empathy. Vulnerability is the building block for trust. It's the building block for trust. The challenge, the kind of the freedom that leaders have is that if they're willing to engage that kind of vulnerability with the young person they're interacting with, they invite them into a place where they can be known. And they're longing to be known. Why would social media be so popular? So we have this kind of vulnerability piece, and if y'all are familiar with a lady by the name of Brene Brown, she says vulnerability builds trust, and trust builds and breeds vulnerability. So there's an interactive system that goes together into that, and a leader can show what that looks like very, very powerfully, actually, because whenever we're in a leading position, I'm seeing something on my screen here, whenever we're in a leading position, they wouldn't expect us to do that. They wouldn't expect us. They see authority, power, and I don't give power away. But vulnerability is giving power away. It's like I'm telling you something that you can use against me. That's why they never tell anybody anything most of the time, because they think information is power. One of the things I do at CCU is I have two different classes, one in shame and grace and the other in grief and loss, and all of my students have to go through a group. And you would think it was a fate worse than death, because they do not want to let go of the control of the information about themselves, and yet they long to be known, and yet they run from being known, let alone knowing themselves. So vulnerability, connection, and empathy inevitably go together. Empathy flows out of our willingness to know ourselves well enough to see something in somebody else, and to identify it, and to say, I've got a clue of what your world is like. I don't know it, I don't live it, I can't say I know things like that, but I certainly know, an understanding of what that actually is like. So, and then lastly, they help us to become a real person God meant to, created us to be, which is all this, if you think about the description of Jesus, it's a man full of grace and truth. So it's not only truth. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, we major on propositional truth, and we struggle with embodied truth, which is really what grace is all about, is how do I embody truth to another person? I don't always have to tell them that. And unfortunately, our youth have gotten really good at looking extremely compliant in listening, and they're somewhere else. So then the question is, how do I get around that? Well, I just breaking down the wall is not enough. I have to find a way to embody truth, and that's part of this living in this tension, because sometimes we see grace and truth at war with one another, when in fact it's highly empowered, if you will, because Jesus modeled that for us. He was that. So how did he do it that we could get some ideas about it? Some of the people that he interacted with in those days was absolutely mind-blowing and revolutionary, because he violated all of all of the rules of the road. And so somebody that is full of grace and truth does the kinds of things that are necessary and needed by the person, not so much by the culture, and discerning what the culture dictates. The culture our kids are in is ruthless. It's graceless completely. And so there's no give in that at all. I heard a conversation not too long ago that somebody said, we have jettisoned the idea of forgiveness in our culture. It's like once and done, you do something, you're out. You're out. And so, and the interesting conversation is that, well, as I was listening to it, it was like, there are some things I don't forgive people for. And in our faith, we have an anchoring because the very nature of what we come to faith by is by forgiveness, right? So the degree of our forgiveness informs our forgiveness of others. And so that very much comes into play. One author, Henry Nouwen, used to say that forgiveness is grace in action. And it's very much a part of this. So grace is not giving somebody a pass. Grace, one definition that I've talked about before, is just the idea that grace creates a space so somebody can learn a different way. And that's very much a part, I think, of a lot of what we can do. So the model of safety here is Jesus, as I already mentioned. The idea of dwelling is actually invokes the image of the tabernacle. In the Old Testament, in the Israelite days, the tabernacle was at the center of the community. All the other people, all the other tribes were scattered around it. And so when John says he dwelt among us, in one way, if you look at some of the original language, it says he tabernacled with us. He moved the tabernacle in with us, moving into our space with us. That's, again, a willingness to get into these places that are really uncomfortable. Because we get comfortable with how we think and how we see the world, and very convinced of how we see the world is the way it should be. And for most youth, they don't care. They just don't care. So how do you have a conversation with somebody that doesn't care that your perspective is right? Well, you move in and learn the landscape of their part, not try to share the landscape of our own. And then grace and truth as well, as far as what Jesus did. So how to be safe. One of the first things that we find, I think, as far as people that are trying to cultivate being a safe person, is the willingness to ask for help. Sometimes even asking for help for somebody who is less powerful. And saying, I need your help to understand this, or I need your help, whatever that is. In other words, it's the very nature of empowerment, is investing somebody that doesn't have a lot of power with the power to be able to be an equal, to stand with me. And so the being able to ask for help is oftentimes a quality of this. And just recognize one thing, and I'll just repeat it probably again before I leave this area. Not everyone is entirely unsafe, and not everyone is entirely safe. We have a bad day. But there are some days that I have that are bad days. I am not going to be a very safe person. I need to recognize that and own it for myself. But people are not 100% one or the other. A lot of times, depending on the subject, depending on the relationship, depending on a lot of things, will depend on to what degree we are safe. So God places this very high premium on asking, as it says here, almost 800 times in the Bible, he says, ask. So it very much is a nature of a recognition of need. And need, our recognition and acceptance of need, is also a recognition of vulnerability. So these things begin the dots begin to connect. The learning humility, owning our own needs. Again, this is one of these topics, the need topic, is the one that is a hot button issue. Because one, a lot of the adolescents and students that I interact with they don't want to admit they have any needs because they don't want to be that vulnerable. So therefore, they have no needs. Okay, don't eat. But the unwillingness to do that usually ends up getting cloaked with one other word, and it's not needs. It's I don't want to appear needy. So in an effort to not appear needy, they're going to deny that they have any needs, and yet those very things are the things that are going to drive that whole thing along in a lot of the things that they do. So taking initiative, if we ask, we will be given, just as Jesus made clear, and so we have an opportunity to develop a grateful spirit as well. Obviously, I can't get something if I don't ask for it. So another thing to consider is, as I already said, is learning to need. A lot of times I have to teach my students, and they're a little farther down the road, but I have to teach them what needs are. I mean, it seems like the most basic thing in the world, but in an emotional realm, no, it's not. It really isn't. Because essentially, think about the world that they live in. Their world is always out there. It's never in here. I condemn what's in here, okay? A couple or 3 decades ago, it's all the same to me, it seems like, but there was a book written called Being There. And actually it was Peter Sellers' last movie. And the premise of the book is that the main character, Richard Gardner, was literally a gardener, and he gave himself that name because he didn't know what his name was. And he learned everything by what he saw in the TV. So he, instead of living life where he was, he lived life out there. And we've returned to that with social media and carrying around a TV in our back pocket. So the ability to, or the confession of, I'm not sure I know what that is. It's like, well, that doesn't help. But see, a lot of the things that we do, it's like it has to play a function other than admitting that I'm human. That's a novel idea. So confessing my inability, not faking it. I mean, I'm better off admitting that I struggle with identifying what my needs are than just making believe and coming up with something. And keeping good boundaries, we'll talk a little bit about that, and then confessing that you just can't seemingly experience some of those things. Increasingly, as Kimberly said at the beginning, we've got kids that are coming into this, are in the system and moving out of the system. I mean, I see them at CCU with significant mental health issues, and the best they know to do is just to condemn it. And so they condemn their humanity in the process, and that doesn't say anything about the nature of sin or anything like that. And struggling with sin like that, yeah, we would absolutely we have to look at that as well. But at the same time, the struggle itself gets condemned. The struggle itself does. So how do I get out of that double bind? Because if I go one way and say I'm struggling, I'm vulnerable, people can use it against me, hold it against me, or I deny that it's that I look like I have all my stuff together, and everybody thinks I'm wonderful and yay, rah, until the walls come tumbling down, and then what? So the backdrop to this ends up figuring out how to pay attention to our hunger, our longing, the thing that we wish for. Those are all kind of paths that take us into the nature of this. Another one is resistance. We will always meet with resistance. When we start identifying needs, when we begin to try to develop this idea of safety in our relationships, not only from within us, because we're not real sure exactly how to do things. When we feel that way, we're probably not going to take a lot of risks. But in a lot of cases, even in our relationships, people are not real crazy about having safe people. Although, again, this is the paradox that I live in all the time. Is they long to have somebody who's safe enough, to care enough about them to press in, but at the same time they still don't like them. They don't like them. And I jokingly say, well, that's my badge of honor then, that I just irritate people, and that's fine. But the ultimately the resistance that we feel internally around some of these things is really what gets in the way of our growth and the nature of what we actually feel. So we move away from provisions for growth. We want growth without pain. Good luck. Good luck. Watch any kid growing up. It is not pleasant. Now, particularly around adolescence, it's growth, but it's not pleasant. And they you know, we have a wonderful capacity to remember all the good things and forget about the pain and suffering. And that's every bit as important a part of our development as well. So the other part of this is identifying what I'm resisting. If I'm resisting a person, I'm probably not resisting the person. There's probably something they say, some way that they behave, some posture that they take that I'm resisting. And so I have to find a way to identify what that actually is, and taking some time to do that in a lot of ways. Again, as a leader, and a kid's digging in their heels and yet they're hanging around all the time, sooner or later I got to ask a different question, like, what are you looking for? and the kid may not know. They'll say, I don't know. They always say that, right? I mean, if we believed the degree to which they know nothing, we'd think that they've got to go back through the educational system. No, it's always a standard phrase. Or, how you doing? I'm tired. Didn't know that was on the feeling list. Tired, you know. So usually the needs are driven along by resistance and what they tell us about that, and we ultimately, you know, end up finding ways to do the opposite. That's a place to start. The problem with doing the opposite is that in a lot of cases we end up making an error in the opposite direction. Okay, so we see what the problem is over here and say, yeah, this is not a good thing. I don't know what's driving this behavior along, or this need that I feel, and I'm uncomfortable, so what do I do? Well, a lot of times we do the all or nothing thing, and now we just kind of let everything hang out, which is not safe either, because not everybody's safe around us. So there is a good portion of this that goes into being safe, inviting the truth about yourself. Safe people invite the truth. Safe leaders invite the truth. How do you see me? How do you perceive me? It's because being a professor is odd. It's the same way like kind of being a pastor, is that you're defined by your role almost as much as the person of who you are. And that same thing is true of what I found here. Being a counselor, it's a very different thing. You know, you're defined differently. So being in the role that I'm in now is a little strange. But automatically, at least in college, when a professor is intimidating. And then I have to find some way to have enough of a relationship to find out I'm on your side. I'm not I'm not going to use the information against you or any of the other things that go with intimidation. But it's a power differential that we end up looking at and talking about. So a couple different questions up here that oftentimes I'll challenge the students to say, ask you, what do I do that draws you to me, and what do I do that pushes you away? And sometimes they'll find who really is safe enough to answer that question honestly. And it may not be pleasant, but they find out the courage of their friends, who's willing to actually move into that place. So a safe person wants to make sure that you're anchored in what truth actually is. And truth, just as an aside, the challenge of, I think, use is, as I said a minute ago, is that spoken propositional truth is what anchors us to see the world, understand who we are, understand our identity, but embodied truth is where it's actually lived out. And that same thing is true with our young people, is that they can ascribe to the propositional truth. There is gravity. Got it. But how do I handle myself in a situation so that I'm safe? And what's modeled for me in all of that? And so the whole idea of truth is not only what I call big T truth, the truth that anchors us, the truth that's universal, applies to everybody, but somehow embracing and accepting the little t stuff of my world and how I see things and how I experience things and all that ultimately goes into that. So the other thing, like I said a minute ago, is entering into forgiveness and living in grace. This is not the culture that our youth are functioning in. There's punishment. A lot of times they end up punishing themselves before somebody else can do it to them, and so that leads into them again, kind of fuel for the fire of the mental health crisis we're in. Suicidality and self-destructive behavior, self-harm. If you look at the curve between self-harm amongst girls and the onset of social media, you will see a corollary rise, dramatic rise in self-harm. And again, why? The culture of comparison. I get to see and look in on somebody else's highlight reel, but then I have to live my life as I see it. And that same thing ultimately is true here. So accepting grace and accepting ourselves as we are, not as we should be. I'm not going to change if I don't accept where I'm at. I cannot change what I won't accept. And that's a fundamental premise ultimately that we either model or we speak, but if we're going to speak it, like I said, we have to embody it somehow. Ultimately, this is the part of integrating the judged and condemned parts of ourselves. All of the youth I have ever interacted with, from back in the 80s all the way to the 2020s, there's always condemned parts of them. They do something that we call active mastery in psychology. I'll hurt me before you hurt me, because after all, you will hurt me. And the other side of that coin is, somebody says something nice to them and say, yeah, but if you really knew me the way I know me, you wouldn't say that either. See, there's always this kind of boomerang effect that's going on in youth. So we have to encourage and move toward integrating these condemned parts. They're sure that if they even admit that it's there, it will make all of them condemned. So it's easier to contain the damage into one compartment. And so we end up with young people that are disintegrated. They're not integrated at all. And they see that as survival value. Actually, it is survival value in the world that they're living in. So, entering into forgiveness and living in grace, what to cultivate? A spirit of repentance. A lot of times we don't talk nearly enough about this. We talk a lot about forgiveness, but repentance is an inconvenient thing that we're called to, because it oftentimes it means two things. I mean, in Scripture at least, the Hebrew word for repentance is teshuvah, which means to return. In the Greek that it's used is metanoia, which we oftentimes talk more about, and that is changing one's mind. The interesting thing about it, and I'll just leave you to do this, but if you look at the story of the prodigal son, Jesus described the prodigal son in both of those terms. He not only returned, but it also says when he was sitting having lunch with the swine, he changed his mind. And so we oftentimes marry those two things together, and it's changing my mind to change my direction. And so repentance is very much a part of that. If I'm willing to move into and accept where I am and where I live and the things that I struggle with, guess what comes out of that? Empathy for other people. Because now I can see that in them. I know the depth of how that feels. And so admitting faults without rationalizing or making excuses, yeah, but you, that's one of the phrases that oftentimes I ban in conversations. It's like, yeah, but you did this, that, and the other thing. And so essentially we've just negated our own responsibility and owning our own stuff, if you will. So learning to repent and confession. We have two sides of the same coin, right? And in 1 John, when he talks about confess your sins one to another, and you will be healed, it also is repeated in James. But on the other side, it's confess your sins to the Heavenly Father, and He's righteous and just to forgive your sins. So it's confession to one another, but also confession to God, and that is the precursor. So learn to take forgiveness. Taking forgiveness is accepting grace, just simply put. And we want to have a contract. In other words, if I did something wrong, somebody needs to be punished. I will punish that person, and then you can know that I've changed. And rarely does that ever happen. So the other parts of this, forgiveness flows out of our forgiveness. I already mentioned this. Forgiveness ultimately frees someone. And generally, it's the chain that holds me to the other person that demands that they change. Corrie ten Boom once said, forgiveness happened tonight, and a prisoner was set free, and that prisoner was me. She had the conversation with an SS guard that was at the concentration camp where her and her sister died. So it frees someone. There's freedom from the past and the tyranny of the past, the freedom from the demand for the offender to change. We leave that in God's hands, and made very clear that God will be the judge, not us. And the freedom to invest love in others. So the other part of it is learning and figuring out how to give something back. I mean, if I embark in this process, if I cultivate safeness within me, then how do I now turn not only from accepting the nature of who I am, but how do I turn the focal point, if you will, back to people that are around me? And that's part of this, is asking for help and being there and all of these things. This is a call to arms for leaders in a lot of ways. To be able to understand what I've been given, but then also being able to recognize needs signals. You know, the kid that just won't go away. And that can be an irritation, but at the same time, that's a need signal. And it opens the possible door of a conversation about what's going on. I mean, what like I said, what are you looking for? And they're standard phrases, I don't know, but that's okay. It's like, well, imagine you did know, what would you say? And that always throws them for a loop. So, tell the truth in season. I think one of the things that I remind people all the time is truth is important, but it is important when it is seasoned with the need of the person I'm speaking it to, not my need to be profound. And so it's very much a part of how do I respond to the needs that I see, rather than the need that I have to say something in a particular way. So now let me shift gears a little bit. Hopefully I'm doing okay. What I want to talk about is just the idea of boundaries. Boundaries has gotten a really bad rap generally in the Christian community. They think it's a pop psych concept and things like that. And part of it is because our definition is so bad. We really don't understand very well the nature of this. And I'm not going to show you this, but let me back up. What are boundaries anyway? We're surrounded by boundaries, right, all the time. Walls, windows, doors, all sorts of things. So in the physical world, we've got lots and lots of examples that go along with it and fit with it. And in the world, in the spiritual world, ultimately, the idea of boundaries actually define our soul. Proverbs 4:23, a lot of people are very familiar with. Watch over your heart, guard it with all diligence, for from it flows the well springs of life. Well, the well is the soul, the heart, rightly defined in terms of Scripture, is broader than just the seat of emotions. It's desires and dreams and hopes and volitions and emotions and all of that in it. So it defines the nature of who I am, and understanding how important it actually is. So they define our soul. This is the one I tend to point to a lot, and that is, it's me and not me. And not in the physical sense. We love to talk about facts, but we don't talk about meaning. So the idea that where do I end and somebody else starts? Now in the physical world it's very easy. In the emotional world it's not as easy. Partly because, again, what's determined by their connectedness to each other is how does it feel? And so if I'm somehow slightly detached, I'm disloyal. And I'm abandoning this person. So ultimately, boundaries are basically determined, or we understand it in terms of what's mine, what's me, and what's not me. Your emotions are not my emotions. And in fact, I can say that. But when I'm connected to somebody and they're having an emotion, now the boundaries get fuzzier, and suddenly their emotions become my emotions, and I've got to do something about it, and now I feel helpless. Which is understandable, because I'm trying to fuss around in an area I don't have any power over. So the me and not me, and then another one is 2 and 4. This is one of these things where Scripture gives us some great examples, great pictures. Paul does in Galatians 6, 2 and 5. And I call this the Boulders and Backpacks verse. Because bear one another's burdens, the Greek word for burden is boulder. Something so big, so onerous, so overwhelming, it's crushing the person. They can't possibly carry it alone. And so there are times I need to come alongside and carry it for them. Boulder, okay? Get all the way down to the bottom, and he says, for each one should bear his own load. Then you say, wait a minute, Paul, you're confusing things here. And it's like, yeah, no, not really. Because when we look at the original language again, load literally means knapsack. We've got people running around with knapsacks all the time. We just call them backpacks, right? And the nature of that, there is that within it we carry everything that we're responsible for our day or daily. That's ours. And so how do I call another, even a young person, to say, look, that's theirs, not yours. And how can you encourage, support, coach, support, all of that, the other person to carry their backpack? They wouldn't think, well, I suppose prank, but they wouldn't think of picking up somebody else's backpack, and they go inside and they find out, oh yeah, this is not my stuff. Horrified, because then somebody else is seeing their stuff. But that's part of the nature of 2 and 4. Being responsible to somebody is allowing it to be theirs, to encourage, support, coach. And then when I recognize the fact somebody is so overwhelmed, so buried with this, I come alongside and carry it for them. For a time. It's not always forever, but it certainly is for a time. And then the last one is the nature of boundaries, is it keeps the good in and the bad out. And it's a simple way of saying all of our, any boundaries we have, and even in the emotional world, need to have gates. And I'm the gatekeeper. Not somebody else, I'm the gatekeeper. I'm the one that determines who comes in and who doesn't come in, who's allowed access and who isn't. And unfortunately, at least in youth, it's not a boundary, it's a wall. And again, 40 years ago, I had some adolescents, I was working with them in the hospital, and I actually gave them a piece of butcher block paper, and I said, so draw me what your wall looks like, or boundary. I talked a little bit about this with them. And one guy in particular did a full-blown wall with glass across the top, and Doberman pinschers running along the top of it, and a moat in front of it with the crocodiles, and I looked at this and it's like, holy cow! And I say to her, wait a minute, somebody's would have to be Indiana Jones to get to you. You say, yeah, exactly. That's the point. We're back to that. It doesn't change that much. So we need gates and not walls. And this is a subtlety that's lost, because it's safer to have walls. It's safer to yell at people from your walls, and then they can yell back, and I'm still safe. And that's a bigger value, I think, oftentimes for youth, is safety. Safety, certainty, some measure of predictability because of maybe the families they're coming from are not very predictable. So the other thing I'd mention, well, we already talked about some examples, but a few things that I want to kind of underline. Obviously, our words are boundaries. You know, the one word they banned from their vocabulary, no. It's the most basic boundary word in our vocabulary, is no. I won't do that. So words accomplish that for us. Obviously, truth creates a dividing line of what's truth and not truth. So there's that, and then also the idea of distance. Now, this one we use a lot, actually. In psychology, we call it a geographical cure. So when somebody's having trouble, they move away. Now, our kids, our adolescents and students may not be able to move away, but they can emotionally. And so they end up living lives of dissociation. In other words, what they show out here, they're living out here, but they're safely ensconced behind their little prison wall. And they all know it's a prison. They know that. And then, of course, time. So some specific problems I'm going to highlight here. And again, the same thing applies with safety as it does with boundaries, is that these problems are not something that only one person has. Depends on the nature of the relationship somebody is in. But the one thing that I've seen a lot of is compliance. And compliance say yes to good and bad. The good is not the thing that puts them at risk. It's the bad. And so, like I said, a lot of times they'll define intimacy in terms of enmeshment. They lose themselves in the other person, and that's what intimacy actually is. But there's very fuzzy and indistinct boundaries. They're trying to minimize the differences with the other person. And some of that is that, again, I can't create a relationship by being too different. I can be lovingly or cutely different, but not too different. And all you have to do is walk through a middle school. It's like, it's a world of independent conformists. So, y'all look alike. Yeah, but I'm different. So, and ultimately the cause is fear. The fear of what? Abandonment. Abandonment, of being left, and what comes with it. So, the other one is the avoidance, saying no to even things that are good. Avoidant is like a way of seeing it, a way of categorizing it, I suppose. And so they say no to good that's even offered to them. As a matter of fact, their fear, which connects with the other one, a lot of these are driven by fear anyway, but their fear is that if I embrace what's good, it will go away. So I'm not going to take the risk of embracing what's good. And so the avoidant does that in the safest terms possible. So they're not going to ask for help. They relativize their problems. Mine's not so bad. And then for them, the boundaries are the walls. They can't come out from behind the walls. And the nature of actually what goes into that. So controllers, this is embedded in a lot of these. There really are two different kind of styles, if you will, within controlling behavior. Most of us can always pick out the ones that are kind of in your face, in your grill kind of controllers. What we don't identify as well is the ones that are more covert. So ultimately, controllers don't respect people's boundaries. They resist ultimately taking responsibility for their own lives. They're looking for somebody else to take the fall, to experience the level of responsibility that goes with it. So the controllers, there are actually two different types. The first one is aggressive. That's the one we all know. You know, they don't listen. If they listen, quote unquote, if they listen, it's for their response. It's not really listening to understand. So they run over fences. They are physically, verbally abusive, manipulative as well. So there really is no place to say no. If you say no, it's just a challenge to overcome. That's part of the aggressive controllers piece. And then the second one is the manipulative controllers. These are the ones that are stealth. controllers. A lot of times in relationships, what I've seen at least, a lot of times what you find is if there's an overt controller, there's a covert controller. And what I mean by covert is how they think about things. It's always an if-then statement, or if I, then you, if I don't show this, they won't do this, etc. And all of that is still around the kind of premise that I don't want to give them the opportunity to choose. And that's what control tends to do. It steals choices from people. So they'll be, the one thing about aggressive controllers, you never have to guess. So there's one way to look at it is they're honest. You know, it's right out in front. Nice to know how controlling you are. Let's move on. But the manipulative controllers, you don't know it until it's too late. And so they're less honest in that regard. In a lot of ways, they spend time persuading, influencing, but there's always an agenda, and there's always a right agenda specifically. So a lot of times they'll play with making circumstances look a particular way to help the other person, help, of course, is in quotes, help the other person to make the right decision. And so think back to what we talked about even with safe people. Freedom and grace. And freedom is about empowering and expanding the options of the person to choose. Controllers are not about that. They're about constraining the options. So, and then the last one is the non-responsives. The non-responsives don't really hear the needs of other people. They're in their own head a lot. And usually their approach is to suck it up, buttercup. Just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get moving, get on the way. This has been enough time, whatever the phrase is you want to use. The interesting thing is, and in a lot of cases, youth use this with themselves. It's like, suck it up. It doesn't matter. Nobody cares. Nobody's listening. So just do what you got to do and move on. And ultimately, they're so taken with that emphasis that they can't hear the needs of anyone else around them. And that's the backdrop here of what's going on. And in a lot of cases, most of the time, we will characterize adolescence as self-consumed. And some of that self-consumption is all the stuff that's going on behind the scenes in their heads. And whether they know it or not, they're paying attention to it. At least in psychology, one of the things we say all the time is divided attention is no attention at all. I mean, watch distracted driving, right? But that same thing is true is what's distracted the person's attention is monitoring all these negative kind of toxic narratives going on about how they look, how they say, they shouldn't have said it that way, they should have done this, that, and the other thing. And then the flip side of that is they're paying so much attention to that, they can't really be present with the person out in front. And there are plenty that will distract the back with the front. And so they throw themselves into these relationships to be so engrossed and so enmeshed that they forget that that's still back there. So this divides up very easily. The people who can't say no is the compliant. It's very easy to understand. The person who can't hear no is the controller. At least in the world of psychology and working with people, we say this is a match made in hell. Because literally they complement one another. And then the people that can't say yes is the non-responsive, and the person that can't hear yes is the avoidant. And so these lay out in this particular way when we're talking about adolescents and how they engage things. Again, the dynamics, the specifics of the dynamics have changed a good bit. And again, we can point at social media, we can point at youth culture, we can point at a lot of things in that regard. But there's a lot of things that aren't different. And I can say, having interacted with adolescents for 40 years, I've seen the change, but the basic dynamics of how they evaluate themselves internally, that's a lot the same. It's just what's added to it is now they have an even bigger sample size to add to that toxic narrative that they didn't have back when I was first working with adolescents. So that part, I think everybody uniformly agrees. Social media has changed the landscape of how we have to interact with youth differently that way. So the one thing I will mention to you is that this generation, a lot of you probably are way more expert about this than I am, but this generation figures out the quality of their lives by the quality of the relationships they have. And so I think what that means then is that leaders end up having to be more committed to developing relationships in a particular way rather than looking for correction. What can be corrected, what can be made better, all of that. That there is due time for that. But we've got kids that are really cagey. They've been hurt a lot, and you look at the dysfunction in the family and the increase of just the sexual abuse, domestic violence, a variety of other traumas that kids are experiencing. Trauma changes somebody. We underestimate how much it does. We think that just stating the fact of trauma is enough to actually work with it or help it. It isn't. I think it behooves professionals in whatever area to have an understanding of trauma, because that is the leading edge right now in mental health, is trauma-informed care. And why? Because that's where they are. And they're coming from some pretty crazy family life. Now the ones that don't, great. But the one common denominator is the one that I already mentioned, and that's social media. Everybody's been poisoned by that. So, there's a part of this to responding to mental health issues that I'll just kind of land the plane here. And that's managing boundaries well. I think, again, we have to be mindful of the impact on young people as far as their chaotic family life, unpredictability. They then become committed to predictability somewhere. And one way to do that is usually with some fairly unhealthy strategies. Depression and suicidal thoughts, again, boundaries come into play. Is at what point do I assess that it's time for some intervention in some sort? The one thing that I've noticed happen is that a kid comes and talks to a caring adult, and if the first thing out of their mouth says, "Well, have you seen a counselor lately?" That's all good. That's great. But it does nothing for the relationship. It's an intervention. Now, when you have a kid that's suicidal, clearly you have to do that. I get that. But the vast majority of kids are in the preceding of that. And if we can't, the thing I think the leaders have to do, and this is why I think getting clear understanding of what the internal narrative is that if a leader can identify that for the kid, suddenly you become a safe person, because you're saying out loud, which they're terrified of doing, you're saying out loud what's going on in here. And they're going, oh, suddenly, yeah, it really does sound that way in my head. And this person is saying what it is, and they're still here. Because they run from themselves. I mean, that's the backdrop to this. So the other one is just anxiety. This becomes a pervasive problem that has been around for a long time, but it's on steroids because of social media and other things like that. Anxiety and fear are very connected. Fear is immediate. I'm physically threatened with fear. Anxiety is, I take that fear and say, and if this continues and into the future, I will not survive. Now we've got an anxiety loop. It just feeds on itself. And so a lot of times I think kids approach people in authority to be their anchor for them because they're already spinning. And so anchor me, let's talk about life, whatever that is, talk about, sports teams, talk about interests and hobbies and things like that. That's anchoring. It doesn't seem like much. We get so focused on the issues themselves that we forget about the nuts and bolts of the relationship with the kiddo. I've already mentioned something about self-harm. This is, when I was in practice, it was kind of an outlier for adolescent girls, the self-harm. By the time that I moved here to Colorado in 2000 and was on and out of practice, I noticed that this thing was kind of growing. It's like, how is it happening? Well, word of mouth, comparisons, all of that. And then 2011, social media hit, and literally all hell broke loose. And then it's so common that mental health workers expect to see it. And the boys are not immune. Boys do it in other ways. They're a little bit more subtle. They may not use an instrument, they will just use people. So they'll pick a fight, and the person will do the self-harm. As we say, even in another arena, it's death by cop. Now it's harm by other people, and they don't even know that they're engaging in it. So, and then of course sexual trauma, we continue to have that. The objectification of everybody, really. I think most of the time when you hear the word objectification, we always connect it to sexuality and everything like that. I think we objectify way more than we really know, particularly when we see the other person as a means to an end. It's objectifying somebody. Actually, we objectify God in a lot of ways. It's like, what have you done for me lately? And then my relationship spirals. So the mental health issues are pretty key in terms of cultivating these qualities that I'm talking about and modeling. It's all, ultimately, it's modeling, but not modeling necessarily hoping that the kid catches it. It's modeling because this is the best thing even for me. And then I can talk about it intelligently and understand it from that point of view. So, okay, I'll turn the fire hose off. I've got a lot more. I'm indebted, by the way, just to some of this material. I'm indebted to some co-workers I had many years ago by the name of Henry Cloud and John Townsend. I used to work with them, and we used in our hospital programs all the time when I worked at the Minnesmeyer Clinic, and I've just ported this over into everywhere else. So, you go to CCU and you interview any of the psych students and say, what do people talk about? Well, Mrs. is always talking about boundaries. Yes. So let me see if you have any questions, and then we can let you eat in peace. Yeah.
So I worry about being a safe person, and we're talking about referring you to a counselor. Like, I've had lots of training and lots of development, but I'm not a licensed counselor.
Right.
When do I, as a worker, cross that line?
To make the referral, you mean?
Yeah, or when it's like, you shouldn't be talking to this person about this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a rough understanding of lethality, I think, is key. As to what degree is the kid armed? Not right. Literally armed, but I mean, do they have the tools necessary? And recognize they don't need much. I mean, take the tip off of a Bic pen, and you have enough to scar your hand. So it's the longer conversation about not only lethality, but also kind of the level of toxicity that they're talking about themselves, that I still need to engage the conversation somehow. But I can also say, at some point, have you ever thought about talking to somebody else? And they say, no, I never do that. It's, okay, don't press too hard. And then the next time we talk, they'll come up again. And generally, I think repetition and consistency over time actually gets them to the point of doing that. So the other part of it is you can always offer and say, hey, I'll take you. No, I know. All these, talk about boundaries. Driving a kid somewhere and all the other things that go with it. But at the same time, it's trying to be a moral support to remove some of the resistance. Now, you can't remove it all. And sometimes, I have been like this. I have been pulled into a youth group to talk about stuff like this, and then it demystifies somebody like me. It's like, I'm a normal person just like everybody else is. I struggle with stuff just like you do. And it's like, really? I thought you walked on water. I was like, well, I wish I could, but it doesn't matter. And that's the kinds of things those kinds of exposure, I think, are helpful along the way. And then outside of that, resources like Quiet Cave is putting out is engaging the conversation about it. That's the key as well. And because ultimately adults, in a lot of ways, we tend to offer the solution that's best for us to the other person, instead of what is more fitting to their needs. And so a kid comes from a pretty chaotic family, and mom's working all the time, single mom working all the time, they're latchkey, whatever, and dad's on again, off again kind of thing. Then I think in your own mind you're saying, well, where are the sanctuaries in this kid's life that are accepting, caring people that they can count on, and then just and create those environments, which you're probably already doing, and just pointing them in that direction. Now and again, if you have enough kind of critical mass, you can invite the kids to sit down, with some hot chocolate and say, how's life? and you might be surprised how deep it goes. You might be frightened how deep it goes. But then it might be inviting a counselor friend or somebody in the church or something like that to say, hey, do you mind sitting with me? To listen to these kids through. Like another little bridge that you make possible for them. So the legality and the degree of toxicity are probably the two big ones, at least in my mind, for somebody in listening to it. And I think in our minds, even as adults, it's the level of poison is alarming. And our tendency is to overreact rather than simply be present in it. And even that presence that ends up saying, I'm not put off by this, I'm here, even that ends up being a calming effect, that then they say, oh, I know where somewhere I can go, and I can say this stuff, they're not going to wig out and do all these other things. And essentially what I'm doing, I'm empowering the young person to begin to own more and more of themselves. And then I can empower that to take care of themselves and have the ability to actually move in that direction. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah. So I want to make sure that I'm not passing the buck, but be present to it. Yeah, and that part, you depend on the Holy Spirit, you depend on your own sensibilities to figure the rest out. Because I think generally the people, the folks in ministry that I've interacted with, generally have a pretty good sense, particularly the ones that are working with the youth right now, have a pretty good sense of where's the tipping point. And there's not enough supports in a variety of places in the kid's life, or they're isolated or whatever, that I'm saying, I need to find some way to make the referral and then jump over that line and kind of take the hit, because they're not going to be real happy, but that's okay. So. Any other questions or anything? Yeah.
I wanted to say now, I grew up in an area, or as I grew up without social media. I was bullied big time when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I had a single mom. My mother was only 14 years old. I was raised by my grandmother. But the environment I was raised in, there was no latchkey back when I was growing up.
Yeah, right.
The neighbors would watch you, and you got disciplined if you did something wrong. You just,
Yeah.
So it was a whole different area. But I never grew up with self-esteem issues. and never thought that I would be in the ministry, be preaching or teaching or doing what job, but a whole different era of time that has gone past.
Yep.
And the youth today put the keys to their happiness in somebody else's pocket.
Absolutely.
You see, and that's
Absolutely.
where the problem is, whether you accept me or whether you like me or what. And I guess maybe because of myself, I was an only child. And I grew up, and it was okay to be by myself.
Sure.
It was okay not to have,
Yeah.
you know, a whole bunch of folk. I didn't have to compete with
Yep.
siblings and for attention or whatever.
Right, right. Yeah, welcome to the party. I'm an only kid too. That's why we love standing up front. Right? I couldn't agree more. I think a lot of the older generation has grown up in a more cohesive culture. And where do kids get their self-esteem? It's me in relationship is what self-esteem is about. Now we have kids that culture is fragmented and fractured. And guess what? Their self-esteem is too.
Yes.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a little alarming to watch it all unfold. Yeah.
Because I've even had my cousin, and she wasn't a young person, but an older person, she committed suicide. 58, single, no kids,
Yeah.
had a career. Just said life was too hard, she didn't feel like living anymore.
Yep. Yep.
You know, so you know, I've seen this,
That's
and
tough.
we just have to, in counseling and talking, let kids know, youth know, whoever it may be,
Right.
that God is still in control,
Oh yeah.
regardless of whatever you might think or who else. And see, when we give them a foundation.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm talking about as far as anchoring, but then also the embodying part is we can remind them of that, but you're talking a foreign language to them, because truth is determined by how I feel. So you can say God is in control. Yes, absolutely, I'm with you. Now what? My life is falling apart.
Doesn't feel like it.
Right.
Yeah, and disconnected. That's that disintegration that I was talking about earlier. So you moved into one compartment, the religious thought, church, etc., and then they leave that compartment and go over here, and my life is falling apart, and I'm worthless, and I can't do anything right. And we're used to connecting those things together, and the gap between those compartments is really big, and they need help getting that connection made. So absolutely, anchor still needs to be there, not debating that point at all. It's just that may not be the leading edge of how we relate to kids, is that anchoring truth kind of stuff.
And then also understanding that with choices come consequences.
Absolutely.
You see, if
Yep.
you do this, and this, you know, you
Right.
connect the dots,
Yep.
things are going to happen. But if you do this, and this, also same thing
Yep. I couldn't agree more.
on the positive side.
Yeah. I mean, even from a psych point of view, our kids are developing, we have to take into account the development piece as far as even their brain development. And so that there are consequences to my behavior. I do this, something happens. They're still trying to figure that link out. So it's all the choice right in front of me, all impulse driven. It's like, oh, something happened. Consequence occurred. I got arrested. How did that happen? I was like, wait a minute. Yeah, the brain needs a little bit more time, is what it is. And generally, the decision-making part of the brain doesn't fully develop until about 22. So they're still, I wouldn't say disabled, but they're still developmentally delayed in that particular area. And then you add in all these other influences that interfere with even the development. So that we've got a big, obviously a big hill ahead of us. But I think relationship does a lot It accomplishes a lot of making those connections. When you do this, when you and I talk, this happens. I can teach that. I can teach the consequences idea.
Right. Because at the age of 19, and not to take up all the time, but I made the choice to follow somebody. Got busted for attempted breaking and entering, and I was standing holding a flashlight. I wasn't actually doing anything, but I had never gotten in trouble before.
Yeah.
I was in the military, and a young kid, not knowing like you that I hadn't reached 22 yet. But when they gave me 2 to 5 for attempted breaking and entering, after that, then I had to go to a psychiatric diagnostic center and go through all of this stuff, go to jail and everything. I actually even spent one night in prison. And after that experience, you didn't have to worry about anything. No more. Because I learned by that choice that there was something going on. And I really locked it like going through that treatment. So I never did a life of crime. I stayed with God. I decided to go completely on the other side of what that was.
Yeah, you're the poster child for the come to Jesus moment, right? All right, any other questions or anything? Yeah.
Talk to me a little about the availability of mental health care for youth and children. I have so many parents who say, we just can't find anybody. You know, and I'm in a situation now looking for help for my granddaughter, and I just don't even know where to begin to find help. We're in catch-up, at least in mental health, because we're not only trying to absorb the effects of the pandemic on these kids, but also the normal flow. You know, so we had a flood, and we had gotten accustomed to what the river was like, and suddenly the river is miles wider than we expected. So, and I think that's generally the case in a lot of counseling centers and mental health facilities and everything, is that they're running ragged trying to keep up. I think, you know, at least in the Christian realm, there are some useful resources. For example, Focus on the Family has lists of counselors that the problem is, of course, is you call them and they're already booked up. And so, you know, you're 6 months out.
I
have a granddaughter who lost her dad. Her dad died of alcoholism a month ago, and her mom abandoned her 3 years ago.
Wow.
So here's a 7-year-old who has nobody. You know, she lives with us and we take care of her. But, and I can't find help for her. And where do you turn?
There's just no easy solution. I think what you learn, you know, I think what you learn is you learn about the whole idea of networking, and you call a place and they say, no, counselors are 3 months booked out, and then the next question is, who else do you work with? And then networking around, you know, different counseling centers and things like that.
I can help too. I know some. The big problem I find is insurance, because a lot of people want a counselor that takes insurance, and as you and I know, as therapists, very few do, and
she's Medicaid.
Yes, and it's hard. But I do know some resources I can talk to you after.
Okay.
I do know some. That's what we do. I can help you find some. Referrals.
Anything else? Well, thanks for your attention. Yes.
How do we, us with younger kids and looking at the impending doom of adolescence,
so much to look forward to.
Yes.
How do we raise kids in today's society with social media so ever present? How much do we limit? How much do we expose them to? There's got to be some kind of a balance, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, you know, the irony is that a lot of the creators of social media that left social media, they banned their kids from it until 16. And one guy in particular that I think of, he was part of the creation team for Facebook. And somebody in the audience asked him that question, and he said that was his stance, is like no exposure to it at all, ever. Until, why? Why do we say 16 or 17? It's developed again. And it creates this window where a parent has the opportunity to speak into living life, evaluating things, character discernment thing I was talking about earlier. We have more time, in a sense, to engage that. Now, that puts them on the margins of their friend group because everybody's communicating through that, okay? And so increasingly, the tech companies in their devices allow for parents to dictate how much time, and then it's programmed into and then the kid doesn't have access to it anymore. So you have more power than you used to have. My kids grew up during the Wild West of all of that, and there was no controls, there was no nothing other than a good, well-placed hammer. So, and the continuing conversation, I think, as far as that's concerned. Parents know kind of where the vulnerable spots are with the kids, and so I think we either limit it using the parent controls that I have, get accustomed to using them and do that, or or confiscating it, or the other alternative is to what degree the kid ends up open enough to have the conversation about the dangers. Again, talking consequences, kids inherently believe they are invincible, and none of that will ever apply to them, ever. And no amount of information is going to budge them off that dial. One, they can't process the information very well. Two, they already have a delusional disorder. It's called adolescence. And so you can't really escape it. So then you just put limits on it. Take your hits as a parent, and continue the dialogue. I think more than anything, again, what's the vehicle by which we enter a kid's world? It's always that relationship, that conversation, open-ended questions, not machine gun closed-ended questions. Did you? Should you? Why did you? But help me understand what's going on in your head right now. All right, so. Yeah. Anything else? Thanks so much for giving the time to speak to you guys.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.